In July 1952, the SS United States crossed the Atlantic faster than any ocean liner before or since, a record that still stands today. The U.S. Navy secretly financed her design, on one condition. She had to convert into a troopship carrying thousands of soldiers within days, a deal the government kept classified for decades. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that secret military deal demanded, and why it made her impossible to save. Right now, the U.S. military again depends on aging commercial ships it can't fully crew or maintain. In 1950, naval architect William Francis Gibbs stood inside a guarded Virginia dry dock, hiding his ship's true design. He'd spent most of his career designing warships nobody was allowed to talk about, and during World War II, his firm designed the majority of the vessels the U.S. Navy put to sea. Gibbs was self-taught, obsessive, and famously terrified of fire, ever since a liner called the Morro Castle burned in 1934 and killed more than 100 people. So when he finally got the chance to build the fastest ocean liner ever attempted, he built her almost entirely out of metal, no wood, anywhere, except a single butcher's block below decks. Even the coat hangers were metal. That obsession made her nearly fireproof. It also made her something closer to a warship wearing evening clothes. The dry dock where they built her had originally been carved out for an aircraft carrier canceled before construction started. When that carrier died on paper, the space got handed to Gibbs instead, and the secrecy habits of building a warship came with it. Engine specifications, classified. Hull form, classified. Display models of the ship's bottom were deliberately altered so nobody could calculate her true speed. This wasn't showmanship, it was policy. That's the part everyone gets half right when they tell this story. Most people who've heard of the SS United States know her as a glamorous liner, the fastest passenger ship ever built by an American company. A national point of pride. That's true, it's just too small, because glamour isn't what the government was paying for. Here's what actually happened. Building her cost roughly $77 million. The U.S. government covered a majority of that, somewhere around 58%, split between a Navy subsidy for what were officially called national defense features, and a maritime administration subsidy meant to help American shipping compete internationally. United States Lines, the private company whose name was on the hull, put up less than half the money for its own flagship. This was not a company buying a ship. It was the U.S. government buying most of a weapons platform and letting a private company run the restaurant. The subsidy had a champion. Vice Admiral Edward L. Cochran, a former Navy shipbuilding chief who'd just become the government's top maritime administrator, pushed hard to get this deal structured exactly this way. A passenger liner on the outside, a military asset underneath. The strings attached were specific. Under the Merchant Marine Act, in exchange for that subsidy, the ship had to be built so she could convert into a troop transport, capable of carrying somewhere in the range of 14,000 soldiers, more than 10,000 nautical miles, without stopping to refuel. That range was far more than any transatlantic passenger route ever required. She wasn't just fast. She was built to run further than the paying customers would ever need her to. Everyone thinks this is a story about an ocean liner. It's really a story about a defense contract wearing a tuxedo. And once you understand that, the rest of the ship makes different sense. Those 4 turbines that tore her across the Atlantic in July 1952 weren't tuned for fuel economy. They were tuned to hit wartime dash speed on command. She could burn something like 700 tons of oil a day at cruising speed. Nobody worried about that in 1952 because oil was cheap and the subsidy was covering the difference. That engine room wasn't a mistake. It was exactly what the contract demanded. The bill for it just hadn't come due yet. This was the early 1950s. The Cold War had just begun, and a superliner faster than anything Britain or France had built was exactly the kind of proof the era rewarded. She launched into service that July to genuine excitement. On her maiden voyage, she crossed the Atlantic faster than any liner in history, breaking a speed record that had stood for a century, a record she'd hold for the rest of that century too. Presidents sailed on her, movie stars sailed on her. Over the next 17 years, she carried more than 1 million passengers across roughly 800 crossings. For a while, she genuinely looked like the future of ocean travel. Cunard's Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth were still the prestige names on the route, older, heavier, slower. The SS United States beat them on pure speed, and for most of the 1950s, that felt like enough. Then October of 1958 happened, and everything about the transatlantic crossing changed at once. Pan Am started flying Boeing 707 jets across the Atlantic, and within 2 years, jets were carrying something like 70% of all transatlantic passenger traffic. A trip that took the SS United States 3.5 days took a jet a few hours. That's the part of this story most people already know. Jets killed the ocean liner. It's not wrong. Here's the part that made it so lethal, though. A jet doesn't need a hull. It doesn't need 1,000 crew members or a pier or 700 tons of fuel a day. Boeing and Pan Am could add a route or cancel one in a season. The SS United States couldn't do either quickly or cheaply because everything about her had been built for permanence, not flexibility. The disruptor of the 1950s had just gotten disrupted by something even lighter than she was. It's just too small to explain what actually happened to this particular ship, though. She wasn't the only casualty. Cunard's own successor ships, the SS France and later the QE2, watched their passenger numbers shrink through the same years, proof this wasn't one company's failure, it was an entire category of travel getting quietly replaced by something lighter. But most of those other liners weren't carrying a hidden military mortgage. The SS United States was. This is where people get the timeline wrong. They assume she died because jets took her passengers. But the first real crack in her foundation showed up before the jets ever mattered, and it came from the same government that built her. In September of 1960, the government canceled its contract to use her for transporting military dependents overseas, one of the arrangements tied to her original subsidy deal. It was a relatively small piece of her business, but it was also the first sign, years before her public collapse, that the government's commitment to this ship was conditional, not permanent. That's the part that still bothers me. Everything about her had been engineered around the assumption that the government would keep needing her. And the government's first real move was to quietly cancel a piece of that promise, years before anyone called this a crisis. This is the moment the company stopped being the future and started becoming vulnerable. Not because anyone announced it, because the one partner who could absorb the ship's enormous fixed costs without blinking had just shown, for the first time, that it wouldn't always be there. What followed wasn't one dramatic collapse. It was a slow tightening, one pressure layered on another, each closing off a little more room to maneuver. Start with the crew. A ship built to naval survivability standards doesn't staff like a normal liner. She sailed with roughly 1 crew member for every 2 passengers, a ratio built for damage control, not profit. Every crew member had to be paid whether the ship was full or half empty. That crew struck in 1961 and again in 1965, lost revenue on a ship with almost no financial cushion. Then add the fuel. Those wartime spec engines were burning through oil at a rate built for military urgency, not commercial economy. Fuel, crew, insurance, maintenance, dock fees, none of that goes away just because fewer people buy tickets. Then add ownership. In 1968, a company called Walter Kidd and Company bought United States Lines. Kitty wasn't in the business of running ocean liners for national prestige. They were in the business of making money, and passenger shipping wasn't making them any. The new owners had no emotional stake in a Cold War flagship. They just wanted out. Then Congress made the decision that mattered most. The operating subsidy that had kept her running, roughly $12 million a year, wasn't renewed for the coming fiscal year. Even with that subsidy still in place, the company had already lost close to $5 million in 1969 alone. The math had already failed before the government pulled the plug. That's what a fixed cost trap looks like from the inside. Almost every major cost was locked in before a single ticket sold. The crew paid, the engines fueled, the insurance renewed, no matter how many passengers showed up. A company with that kind of cost structure needs steady, growing demand just to break even. The SS United States never had steady demand again after 1958. She had a shrinking one, chasing a fixed set of bills that never shrank with it. One of those pressures alone, she probably survives. But all of them stacked together on a ship whose entire design had been dictated by a military contract instead of a business plan, there was nowhere left to cut. In November of 1969, mid-overhaul, at the same Virginia shipyard where she'd been secretly built, the SS United States was pulled from service. Not with a farewell tour, not with a final voyage. She simply didn't sail again. Passengers who'd sailed her weeks earlier had no idea they'd taken her final crossing. Roughly 1,000 crew members lost the jobs built around her schedule, with no warning either. This was not a company gracefully retiring an aging asset. It was a government-subsidized flagship getting switched off mid-repair, the way you'd shut down a machine that had stopped being worth the electricity. And here's where the story should have ended, the way it ends for most old ocean liners, sold off, scrapped, or converted into something else. Except this ship couldn't do that either. The same classification that had protected her design in 1952 was still legally attached to her in the 1970s. In 1976, a shipping entrepreneur named Knut Kloster tried to buy her. The sale fell apart, in part because her design was still officially classified, which meant the government wouldn't approve selling her to a foreign buyer. Declassification finally came in 1978, a decade too late. By then, the ocean liner business she'd been built to dominate barely existed. This was not an ordinary ship struggling to find a buyer. It was a Cold War asset, still legally treated like one. Years after the war it was built for had changed shape completely. The secrecy that once protected her as a weapon was now the exact thing outlawing her only realistic buyer. What came next was decades of nothing, punctuated by false starts. Every few years, somebody with a plan saw potential in her, a floating hotel, a casino, a cruise ship reborn. In the 1990s, crews in hazmat suits stripped materials out of her hull overseas, chasing the same problem that would sink every later attempt. More than 160,000 square feet of asbestos packed into her structure specifically because Gibbs had built her to survive a fire a warship might face. Royal Caribbean looked and walked away. Norwegian Cruise Line bought her in 2003, then walked away too. Crystal Cruises studied reviving her in 2016 with estimates near $700 million and walked away as well. The exact fireproofing that made her a masterpiece of naval engineering made her a toxic, unsellable liability by the time anyone tried to save her as a business again. A brand can survive. A ship can't fake it. The name SS United States kept generating headlines and nostalgia for 50 years. The actual vessel just sat there rusting because nobody could afford to touch her. For nearly 30 years, she sat at a pier in Philadelphia next to a big box shopping strip and an IKEA parking lot, costing roughly $60,000 a month just to keep from sinking at the dock. That's the price of not being able to decide what to do with something. Decades of a ship nobody could sell, nobody could scrap without controversy, and nobody could afford to restore, just quietly draining money to stay exactly where she was. Indecision itself became one of the most expensive things that ever happened to her. She wasn't just a ship anymore by then. She was a monument to a version of America nobody quite knew how to let go of. Over 1 million former passengers who'd crossed on her, a Philadelphia community that had lived beside her rusting hull for a generation, and a preservation group led by Gibbs's own granddaughter, Susan Gibbs, trying to raise enough money to give the ship a second life before time or a landlord forced their hand. In 2024, time ran out. A dispute with the pier's landlord led to an eviction order. There was no redevelopment deal ready to save her. What there was, instead, was a buyer in Florida willing to pay for something very different, not a restoration, but a reef. In February of 2025, crowds lined the Delaware River to watch her leave Philadelphia for the last time, towed out under a bridge she barely cleared. She made her way south to Mobile, Alabama, prepared for a new role as an artificial reef, lowered onto the seafloor roughly 22 nautical miles off Destin, Florida. Compare that ending to the promise built into her steel. She was designed to survive a war and outrun any threat the ocean could throw at her for 10,000 miles without stopping. She's ending her story sunk on purpose, off a coastline she was never contracted to defend, because nobody could find a version of peacetime that made economic sense for a ship built entirely around the assumption of war. So what actually killed the SS United States? Not the jets, not really. They hurt every ocean liner equally, and every ocean liner survived that hit in some diminished form. What killed this one specifically was the deal that built her in the first place. The government paid for speed, range, and survivability far beyond anything a paying customer needed, in exchange for a legal claim on her body in case of war. That claim shaped every expensive, uneconomical thing about her. The fuel-hungry engines, the oversized crew, the asbestos armor, the classification that outlawed her sail for a decade after nobody wanted to sail her anymore. She wasn't a commercial ship that happened to get some military funding. She was a military asset that happened to serve dinner. And the moment the government's interest in that asset cooled, there was no ordinary business left underneath it that could survive on its own. Every failed sale, every abandoned renovation plan, every dollar spent just keeping her afloat in Philadelphia, all of it traces back to a single clause written into a subsidy contract in 1950. Zoom out far enough and the SS United States stops being a story about one ship. It becomes a question about how a country decides which parts of its transportation system are too important to leave to the market alone, and what happens to the businesses caught holding that responsibility once the emergency they were built for stops feeling urgent. When the government treats a commercial asset as a strategic one, it gets protection for exactly as long as that need is politically convenient. The moment it isn't, the business underneath is left to survive on commercial terms it was never designed to meet. That trap didn't disappear with her. Right now, the U.S. military again leans on a fleet of aging commercial ships to move troops and equipment in a crisis. Ships it doesn't fully own and can't always fully crew. Sea lift readiness has been reported well below the levels the Pentagon says it needs. Roughly 1,800 trained merchant mariners are missing from the workforce that's supposed to keep those ships moving, and more than a dozen vessels have been sidelined in recent years simply because there weren't enough hands to run them. It's the same bargain the SS United States was built under. 70 years later, commercial ships kept ready for a war they may never fight. At a cost somebody eventually has to pay whether that war comes or not. They hid her hull in a guarded dry dock to protect a secret. Now the ocean is hiding it for good. If you want more stories about the transportation empires, history quietly erased, subscribe. There's more of this coming. Did you or someone in your family ever sail on the SS United States, the fastest ship in the world, built as a secret weapon first?